This can't be real, I muttered to myself, peering through the curtains as red and blue lights illuminated my front yard. For the fourth time this month, a police cruiser had pulled up to my driveway. And just like clockwork, I spotted the oh-so-familiar silhouettes of my neighbors creeping behind the rose bushes, their phones pointed my way as they recorded every second. I never imagined that tending to a simple backyard farm could turn me into the neighborhood's most wanted criminal. Hello, folks. If you're reading this, you might be wondering why on earth a 62-year-old retired schoolteacher is stirring up so much drama in a quiet subdivision. Trust me, I'm just as perplexed. But before you assume I'm hiding roosters on steroids or forging goat passports in my greenhouse, let me fill you in on how this fiasco started and why it's been downright impossible to stop. My husband, Horace, and I bought this property in rural Burbia nearly 3 decades ago. Back then, none of these houses were built. There was no homeowners association, no community watch, no strict landscaping rules. It was just us, a couple of acres of farmland, and a panoramic view of rolling hills in the distance. We raised our kids here. We used to keep chickens and a few goats to supplement our small orchard. Over the years, I'd even grown partial to rescuing stray cats. It was a blissful slice of peace and quiet. That all changed 5 years ago when a big property development firm bought up the land adjacent to ours. Almost overnight, they began constructing a massive neighborhood with pristine sidewalks, monochrome lawns, and meticulously uniform mailboxes. By the time they finished, our old farmhouse looked out of place, a relic from another era, living in the shadow of those shiny new homes. Horace used to joke that we were the elderly neighbors everyone avoids at the block party, but that was before we realized exactly how unwelcome we were about to become. Apparently, the developer had included a stringent HOA agreement for the new residents, outlining what color their front doors could be, how often the grass had to be cut, and where to store their trash bins on garbage day. Now, Horace and I weren't part of the new neighborhood. Our property was technically its own parcel of land, and we never signed any HOA documents. Yet these new neighbors just assumed we had to follow the same rules. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a polite letter slipped under our door. "We've noticed your yard is in violation of our standards," it read. Standards? I read the letter twice to ensure I wasn't hallucinating. The letter listed out a half-dozen alleged violations including improperly stored lawn equipment, excessive use of livestock, and unsightly building materials stacked in plain sight. That last one referred to a small pile of barnwood near my shed, what I planned to repurpose for raised garden beds. But I brushed it off. We weren't part of their HOA, so what could they really do? Well, it turns out they could do quite a lot. One by one, my neighbors started calling the cops. It was nothing major at first. Some reported a noise complaint when my rooster crowed at 6 a.m. or insisted they smelled something unusual coming from my property. The local police would show up, shrug apologetically, and remind me that they had to respond to every call. And the cycle continued. The problem is that a decent chunk of the local officers live in or near this fancy new development. They all know each other. Some are related by marriage, some go to the same church, some just wave to each other at the local diner. So every time a neighbor calls, the cops arrive promptly, half convinced I'm hosting a barnyard rave. I still remember one officer standing on my porch, flabbergasted. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he whispered, "but my mother-in-law lives down the street. She's the one who complained." Living right next to an HOA community when you're not part of it is like being the only fish in a pond that refuses to swim in the same direction as the school. It's just a matter of time before the bigger fish decide you're a nuisance. Not long after that first incident, the neighborhood's Friendly Relations Committee decided to pay me an unexpected visit. 3 women, hair sprayed to the rafters, matching pink polo shirts and bright white tennis shoes, knocked on my front door. They introduced themselves as the official go-betweens for the homeowners and the HOA board. I got the feeling they wanted me to shoo away my goats and plow under my gardens. I invited them in for tea, thinking maybe a bit of old-fashioned hospitality might smooth things over. They started with what seemed like genuine concern, praising our orchard of apple and peach trees and remarking how my grandmother's quilts, hung on the living room walls, reminded them of a simpler time. For a fleeting moment, I thought we'd found common ground. Then the ringleader, Linda, cleared her throat in that oh-so-formal tone. She produced a clipboard. "We'd like to discuss your compliance with our community guidelines," she said, flipping through paperwork. Her bright red nails tapped against the pages, and she actually frowned at a black-and-white snapshot of my vegetable garden. "There's been talk of your excess," she continued, scanning her notes. "Turnips, cabbages, chickens, goats. It's a bit overwhelming for some of our residents." "Ma'am," I began calmly, "I appreciate your feedback, but your rules don't apply to me. This farmhouse was built years before your HOA even existed." Linda nodded in a way that told me she'd been practicing for this moment. "You're correct in that you're not legally bound to the same regulations as the rest of us. However," she paused, drawing out the word as if it gave her special power, "the general law of nuisance still applies. If neighbors perceive your activities as bothersome, we have the right to involve municipal authorities." Bothersome. There was in black and white. My life a nuisance. The orchard my husband had planted, the vegetable patches our children helped tend, the goats who provided fresh milk for my grandchildren. Bothersome. I thanked them for their time, told them I'd keep the noise down, and politely saw them out. But in the days that followed, I noticed more and more open hostility. Where neighbors used to wave politely from their driveways, they now turned their backs. Kids who'd ride their bikes by our fence now zipped through as if my place was haunted. The air felt tense, electrified by rumors that I was ignoring important community standards. Eventually, one particular officer started showing up more than the others, Deputy Franklin. He'd come by to investigate claims that my goats were running loose, rummaging through other people's yards. I'd invite him to the backyard where the goats stood chewing lazily in their pen. He'd scratch his chin, embarrassed to have wasted his time, and leave. Then, 2 days later, another complaint would surface. Maybe my homemade compost heap smelled unbearable, or my roosters were crowing after sunset, which, by the way, they absolutely do not. Each time, the officer arrived and found no evidence. Each time, I felt my blood pressure rise a notch. All this nonsense culminated one weekend when I finally decided to host a small farmer's market in my driveway. I'd done it before in years past without any issue, just a handful of us local folk trading apples for fresh eggs, goat cheese for homemade preserves. But this time it drew attention, lots of attention. Half the neighbors were peering from behind their curtains, capturing every transaction on their phones, probably hoping to record some big scandal. Sure enough, four cruisers rolled up barely an hour into my modest gathering. The officers told me there'd been a report of illegal commercial activity. I saw Linda's pink polo peek out from behind a potted hydrangea in a neighbor's yard. That's when I realized it was less about actual wrongdoing and more about intimidation. They wanted to scare me off. While the officers inspected my ID, my produce license, yes, I had one, and my property boundaries, I politely reminded them that this was all 100% legal. I had the permits. The officers, looking equally bored and sheepish, shrugged it off and left. But the message was loud and clear. The HOA was determined to tarnish my little farm by any means necessary, even if that meant lodging one petty complaint after another. I began to worry about Horace. He had always been the one with the level head, but these days, the tension was getting to him. He spent more time out back, hammering away at that old pile of wood or fiddling with the chicken coop. I'd catch him staring at the new development as though trying to burn it down with sheer willpower. He'd mutter about the McMansions and how they were strangling our way of life. In truth, we both knew something had to give. The neighbors weren't letting up, the authorities weren't ignoring their calls, and each morning, I'd wake up unsure if I'd hear roosters or sirens first. Part of me wanted to stand my ground indefinitely. It was my farm, my heritage, my right. But was it worth the daily stress? Then again, maybe there was a way to hold my own without caving in. Maybe if I looked into local ordinances, I could shield myself from the HOA's meddling. That's when I hatched a plan, a somewhat risky, definitely defiant idea that might just force the HOA to think twice before poking their noses into my business again. On a cool, early morning, when the dew still clung to the grass, I found myself poring over the county's zoning regulations at my kitchen table. Decades ago, Horace and I had secured a special permit that classified our property as agricultural. We needed it to keep livestock and sell produce. As I flipped page after page, I realized that our permit had never been revoked or challenged. Our land was legally recognized as farmland. That meant that, short of building a skyscraper, I had broad freedom to use my property for agricultural pursuits. This wasn't merely about legal rights, though. I needed a strategy to defuse the constant complaints. After all, it didn't matter that the cops never found any real violations. The mere spectacle of flashing lights in my driveway had turned me into local tabloid fodder. The farmer lady, they call me at the diner, or the goat woman, if they really wanted to twist the knife. Rumors started circulating that I was manufacturing illicit substances in my greenhouse or running an unauthorized petting zoo. It was comedic if it hadn't been so stressful. I closed the zoning book with a determined thud. Horace, sipping his coffee at the other end of the table, raised an eyebrow. "Find anything interesting?" he asked, wincing a bit at the dryness in his throat. He hadn't slept well for weeks. "More than interesting," I said. "If the HOA thinks they can push me around, maybe it's time we push back, legally." That night, I drove to the local co-op and returned with what was, quite possibly, the largest goat I'd ever seen. A big, burly fellow with curved horns and a demeanor that screamed, "Mess with me at your own peril." Before you judge, let me explain. I wasn't planning to harm anyone or break any laws. But after dealing with petty complaints about my excessive livestock, I had an epiphany. If I was already being accused of having unruly goats, why not actually have one that commands respect? His name was Wellington. I acquired him from a friend who assured me he was perfectly gentle, just bigger than the average goat. When my usual goats saw Wellington, they seemed to perk up, as if they'd gained an alpha in the herd. Horace was skeptical at first, but once he realized I had a cunning plan, he went along with it. See, I'd uncovered a little-known section in the local codes about community outreach and educational programs. Basically, as long as I was using my farm animals for educational outreach to the community, like 4-H clubs, homeschool visits, or even local school field trips, my property was granted additional protections and tax benefits. In other words, if the neighbors wanted to complain about noise or unsightly animals, they'd also be complaining about children's educational opportunities. So, I reached out to a local homeschooling group, offered to host a backyard farming 101 class once a week, and announced it on a Facebook community page, one that included several families from the new development. Within days, I had a roster of interested parents who wanted their children to experience the joys of sowing seeds, collecting fresh eggs, and learning about livestock firsthand. The first class took place on a Wednesday afternoon, right in my backyard. We had about 10 kids, ranging from 4 to 12 years old, plus their parents. I walked them through planting turnip seedlings, introduced them to our chickens, and let them pet the goats, Wellington included. He was a gentle giant, letting them scratch behind his ears. The kids loved it. But of course, the pink polo ladies, or at least some of them, showed up on my fence line, arms folded, sneers ready. I knew they'd call the cops again, but I was prepared. And sure enough, Deputy Franklin arrived, looking more than a little exasperated. By that time, though, I was armed with a binder full of documentation, a list of participating families, the official zoning permits, our status as an agricultural educational site, and a letter from the local 4-H coordinator praising our contributions to the community. When the HOA reps insisted that my illegal farm needed to be shut down, I calmly presented every piece of paper to Deputy Franklin. The parents voiced their support, praising the positive learning environment I was providing for their kids. The deputy, who had zero interest in shutting down a wholesome children's class, told the HOA reps that I was well within my rights. The best part was seeing Linda's jaw tighten with frustration as parents from her own neighborhood thanked me for letting their kids see real farming in action. But the real clincher came a few days later when the local news station got wind of the story. A friendly reporter, hearing about the farmer threatened by an HOA, arranged an interview. I invited her over and showed off the orchard, the goats, and my newly built raised beds. During the interview, I stressed how I was simply trying to uphold a tradition I'd carried on for decades, and I highlighted how popular the educational classes had become, especially since so many folks wanted to teach their children about where food really comes from. The next evening, the segment aired. The station framed it as a heartwarming piece about a local woman using her farm to benefit the community, despite pressure from an overreaching HOA. They even showed footage of Wellington nibbling gently on a little girl's shoelaces, which was unbelievably cute. After that broadcast, something shifted. Suddenly, people around town began cheering me on. I received supportive letters from strangers. A local hardware store donated extra lumber for building more raised beds. Even a local garden club offered to help with my orchard. Of course, that didn't magically solve all my problems. My immediate neighbors still watched me like hawks, and there were more phone calls to the police. But each time an officer arrived, I was able to demonstrate that I was operating within the bounds of the law. Each time, the cops left empty-handed, looking more and more annoyed at having to respond to baseless complaints. Still, I had a sinking feeling that the HOA wouldn't give up easily. They had too much pride, too much at stake in maintaining their perfect community. And frankly, it was exhausting to stay on high alert every day, not knowing which new angle they'd attack from next. That's when Horace offered one more suggestion, a bold one, reminiscent of the kind of protest you'd see in a 1960s campus rally. And we both knew it might just be the final act that could tip the scales definitively in our favor. Horace's idea was simple. Show them what real nuisance looks like, within the letter of the law, of course. We got our chance sooner than expected. One Sunday morning, I woke up to find a letter taped to my mailbox, boasting that the HOA had formally filed a complaint with the county about my large and unrestrained livestock. They'd attached a photo of Wellington, presumably taken by a neighbor who felt threatened by his intimidating horns. The letter threatened legal action if I didn't remove him from the property immediately. I've never been one for blustering theatrics, but Horace had convinced me that a little showmanship could be exactly what we needed to highlight the absurdity of the HOA's claims. So we swung into action. We coordinated with several local families, those who had been attending our educational sessions. Then we called up a few of our old teaching colleagues, some local small farmers, and the garden club members. We explained that we wanted to hold a Farm Appreciation Day on our property to showcase how critical small farms are to the community. It would be a peaceful demonstration of support, complete with hands-on activities, signage, and of course, goats. The day dawned bright and clear. By noon, more than 30 cars lined my driveway and the grass shoulder near the road. Families and friends sprawled across the lawn, laughing with each other, sampling homemade jam, or taking pictures with chickens perched on their arms. Kids were running around, squealing with delight as they fed apples to the goats. Horace was in his element, proudly explaining how each raised bed was crafted from reclaimed barnwood. Wellington stood majestically off to the side, munching on hay, wearing what I can only describe as the most bewildered expression at all the hubbub. We'd erected a few tasteful signs near the property line. Farms equals community, support local agriculture, and we're not in your HOA. People from a new neighborhood trickled in, too, some curious about the commotion, others openly supportive. I was surprised to see a couple who lived at the end of the cul-de-sac, die-hard rule followers, according to rumor, actually purchased some fresh eggs and jam. It turned out they appreciated the idea of having locally grown food practically next door, even if it didn't meet the strict aesthetic the HOA seemed to crave. Naturally, Linda and her posse weren't pleased. Around mid-afternoon, I saw them approaching from across the street, arms crossed, lips pursed. They looked at the signs, at the goats, at the kids, squealing with laughter. You would have thought we'd set up a carnival ride on a minefield, based on their grim expressions. Is all of this really necessary? Linda asked, scanning the crowd like a hawk. She tried to keep her voice low, but it carried. You're making a spectacle of yourself, and, quite frankly, it's disruptive. I smiled sweetly, ignoring the knot in my stomach. We're having a perfectly legal gathering on private property, I said, just loud enough for nearby parents to overhear. If you find it disruptive, You're welcome to return to your side of the fence." Linda huffed, her face turning a lovely shade of crimson. She whipped out her phone and dialed the police. I caught snatches of her conversation, something about public disturbance and uncontrolled livestock. I almost felt sorry for whichever poor officer drew the short straw this time. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, a patrol car slowly rolled up. Out stepped Deputy Franklin, looking as if he'd rather be anywhere else. He surveyed the scene. Children playing, families chatting, goats grazing peacefully. I offered him a paper cup of lemonade, which he declined with an embarrassed shrug. Linda marched over, demanding he shut us down. "Ma'am," he sighed, glancing at Linda, "I've explained multiple times that Ms. Richards here is operating within her agricultural rights. Unless there's actual evidence of lawbreaking, I can't forcibly remove her livestock or stop her gathering." I expected Linda to keep arguing, but this time, something in her eyes flickered. Perhaps she sensed she'd lost the fight in front of too many witnesses. Or maybe the sight of so many folks, some from her own neighborhood, having a grand old time with farm animals shattered her illusions of unwavering HOA solidarity. She snapped her phone shut, pressed her lips together, and spun on her heel, stomping back to the street with her entourage in tow. The Farm Appreciation Day continued without further incident. In fact, it turned into a small block party by the evening, with a local acoustic duo showing up to play guitar and banjo by the orchard. Even Deputy Franklin stuck around to chat with Horace, eventually allowing himself a glass of lemonade, as though he'd been given permission to drop the official front. By nightfall, folks began packing up, leaving behind a few donation jars stuffed with small bills to support our orchard and livestock upkeep. Some parents stayed to help us gather up the folding chairs and leftover food. The following morning, I expected retaliation. Maybe an angry mob outside my gate, or more accusations pinned to my mailbox. But aside from a few lingering glares from the pink polo crowd, there was nothing. Days passed. Weeks. No new calls to the police. No letters from the county. Even Linda's familiar scowl seemed to have softened, or at least she kept her distance. Rumor had it the HOA board was furious they'd come across looking like bullies on the local news, and that Linda had been read the riot act by some of her own neighbors who felt the community was better served by peaceful coexistence than ongoing drama. After all, if potential homebuyers caught wind of an HOA harassing a harmless farm, it might hurt property values. And if there's one thing a new suburban community loves more than uniform lawn ornaments, it's property value. I like to say everything became perfect after that, but life rarely ties itself up in a neat little bow. There are still sideways glances from some of the neighbors, and I continue hearing whispers about my rowdy roosters. But no police cars have shown up in weeks. Parents continue bringing their children by for the after-school farming lessons, and I've even made a few new friends from the same development that once treated me like an outlaw. To me, that's victory enough. I don't need everyone's approval. I just need the freedom to live on my land, cultivate the crops I've loved for years, and tend to my goats, including Big Wellington, in peace. Horace is content, too. His only complaint is that I'm never short on visitors these days, so he doesn't have the quiet solitude he used to enjoy. But that's a small price to pay for preserving our way of life. Sometimes the best way to stand up to a bully, be it an overbearing HOA or an entire crowd of naysayers, is to proudly display who you are and what you believe in, rather than cowering in the shadows. Now, I can step onto my porch each morning, coffee in hand, and watch the sun rise over my orchard without dreading the next siren. And as for the HOA, maybe they've learned a lesson, too. You can't impose your rules on someone who never signed your contract. And you definitely shouldn't underestimate a couple of determined retirees with a spirited goat, a stack of zoning permits, and a community of supporters behind them. The end. Thank you for reading. If you found this story entertaining or relatable, consider sharing it with others who might appreciate a tale of one woman's determination to protect her farm from an overzealous HOA.